All right.
The Compline is actually on a Google Meet, not on this.
Okay. If you're able to share that link in the chat, then other people can grab it. All right. So we are recording. So I'm going to begin with a prayer. This is one of my favorite prayers. It appears in three places in our Book of Common Prayer. It appears on Good Friday as the last of a whole series of what we call solemn collects. Then it appears um, a day later at the Easter Vigil. And then it's also prayed at ordinations. And it's a prayer about the church. And since we're talking about, especially today, the church in history, I thought this would be a good one. So let us pray. O God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably on your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Um,
And just a word about this prayer. In this first line, when it asks God to look favorably on your whole church, the C in church is capitalized. And this is an indication that the Anglican and the Episcopal churches, we consider ourselves to be part of the universal church. It's not a, we're not kind of a separate sect. We participate in the whole church, and we see kind of these multitude of denominations as also participating in the whole church. So the whole church is much bigger than we are. So we're not just praying for God to look favorably on the Episcopal Church. We're asking God to look favorably on the whole church. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, and I'm going to take you through a whirlwind history of the Episcopal Anglican Church and then the Episcopal Church. And I can give you some resources later if you'd like to do a little bit more reading. All right, so I am going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right. So I hope that you can see my screen.
Oops,
Um, is it
sorry. We saw it for a second and then it went away.
okay? It's still there.
yeah, for me, I can see it.
I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can also see it.
Did it
Maybe
still disappear?
let me just maybe go over to the other. I have another screen, so okay.
Okay,
Sorry, thanks.
good. All right. So I call this roots and branches, the origins of the Anglican and Episcopal churches, because the root is in some ways the Church of England, but that root actually goes much farther back before the Reformation. But we are connected kind of organically, really, to the Church of England and the church as it existed even before Roman Catholicism. So we're part of a larger family. And actually, if you look at in the top right corner, you'll see that's the original shield of the Episcopal Church, which came about in 1789, the year that we kind of became our own church. And the kind of our connection to Great Britain is indicated in that shield. So the colors are red, white, and blue, which are certainly the colors of the American flag, but they're also the colors of the British flag. And that the the X-shaped cross in the top left corner is an allusion to the St. Andrew's cross, which is the symbol of the church in Scotland, which is where we got originally our first bishop was consecrated by a bishop in Scotland. So we have a connection, especially to Scotland. And underneath is a new shield that just came out really last year, which is our Pride Shield, and it indicates our commitment to LGBTQ plus full inclusion in our church. So here we go. So I'm going to go back a little bit further and just say that Christianity was in England for a long time, well before the Reformation, and it goes back at least to the fourth century. We have a record that some bishops from Britain were at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. This is the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, which promulgated the Nicene Creed, which is the classic creed that we proclaim pretty much every Sunday. Um, and if you see Constantinople sort of in the middle of the screen. Nicaea is just sort of over across the strait from Constantinople. So that's where this council of the church, both in the East and the West, gathered to talk about issues of faith and practice. But you notice this map covers around the years 250 to about 405 in the Common Era. And so you can see that Christianity was all around the Mediterranean and all the way up here to Great Britain. It wasn't Great Britain then, but Britain was part of the Roman Empire. So because it was part of the Roman Empire and Christianity took hold in the Roman Empire, we're we're fairly confident that Christians, made their way to Great Britain, maybe through some of the Roman soldiers who were there, and others. So we, in a sense, trace our history back even before the Reformation. But after the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West, there were missionaries from two directions. The Celtic lands from Ireland and Scotland, they come in and they start evangelizing England from the west and from the north. And then Pope Gregory the Great sends missionaries from Rome in the late 6th century to preach the gospel to who were called the Angles. That was the kind of the tribe that lived there at the moment. And Gregory actually makes this lovely wordplay on their name. He sees these Angle slaves in Rome, and they have this beautiful, to him, beautiful blonde hair. And he says, "Oh, they're angels. We have to go and evangelize them." So there was Christianity in England very early on. When Rome kind of disintegrated, it came back fairly quickly from all of these directions. And in fact, we learn about this through a man called the Venerable Bede. Bede was a monk in a monastery in the north of England, in Northumbria. And he writes in the early to mid 8th century, he writes this book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And it's from Bede's story. And he writes about the Celtic monks, and he writes about kind of how the church took hold in England. And as he's writing, he's developing this idea that there is such a thing as like the English church. From very early on, the English or the people of that island had a sense of their own kind of unique perspective even while they were very much part of the Roman Catholic Church. But being an island and being sort of off to the northwest, they they had a sense of their own character and their own values and their own development. And in the Middle Ages, we have some English religious figures who contribute to this sense of English Christianity having its own specific character. Julian of Norwich was an anchoress. That means she lived in a tiny cell attached to a village church, the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, which is how she got her name. And she writes, she has these visions when she believes herself to be at the point of death, but writes about her visions and about the love of God in a way that, um, I mean, some would say kind of has a very specifically English character. It's very positive. She's actually the first woman to write a book in English. And so her theology of God as kind of not only as lover of our souls and but also as mother, I think contributes to kind of the unique character of English theology. In the Middle Ages, each region of Europe had its own version of the Roman ritual, the liturgy, with slight variations. So England had their own, Spain, France, um, Italy, they all had slightly different variations. And at the time of Henry VIII, who was born in 1491, um, England also had actually multiple versions of the liturgy. The most common was called the Sarum Rite. Um, which is another word for Salisbury. It originated in Salisbury in the south of England. And this ritual was in Latin, obviously, because everything was in Latin at that time, but it had a very complex ceremonial style. So England had kind of their own style. But the text of that Sarum Rite, especially the Holy Eucharist, became initially the basis for what became the first Book of Common Prayer. So I don't know that you can really see too many traces of the Sarum Rite in our liturgy today, but that's where it started. So when Archbishop Cranmer was able to start working on the first Book of Common Prayer, that's what he had. And so he took that rite, and that's what he translated into English. But just to know that England sort of had its own character at the time of the Reformation. So the Church of England, as a separate entity from the Church in Rome, came about initially because Henry VIII declares himself the supreme head of the church in England in 1534. He separates the church out from Rome, not because he disagrees with any of their theology. Um, Henry is very much he's really a Roman Catholic without the Pope. He believes in clerical celibacy. He wants to keep the liturgy in Latin. He doesn't really want to change anything. He just wants to be the head of the church, admittedly, so he can get a divorce and marry Anne Boleyn. That is a fact. Um, Worship at this point during the history that during the period of Henry was still in Latin. The Bible was not initially available in English. In fact, Henry executed one of the first translators of the English Bible. That being said, if anybody says to you, well, the Church of England just came about because Henry VIII wanted a divorce or wanted an heir, that's not exactly true. That was certainly the impetus for separating the Church of England from Rome. But that's not really where we got our character as a church. So I just want to kind of remind us that Henry VIII is really not so much the founder of the Anglican tradition. He just sets up the context in which the Church of England can actually kind of be born and flourish, but it never really happens until after he dies. So I think that's really important. There was one liturgical rite that was officially published in English during Henry's lifetime, and that was the Great Litany. And if you have a prayer book at home, or if you're here on the first Sunday of Lent, you will you will experience our version of the Great Litany, which is remarkably close to this 16th century Great Litany. And if you have a prayer book or if you want to look it up sometime, um, it's after it's it's after evening prayer and Compline. It actually starts on page 148. Um, but the Great Litany is this long responsive prayer, alternating between a cantor and the congregation. And our responses are things like, "Have mercy upon us, spare us, good Lord, deliver us." It's a beseeching of God to kind of save us and rescue us. And the reason that it was published in English during Henry's lifetime was that Henry was at war with France. And so he very much wanted his congregations to be reciting this lengthy prayer in procession on behalf of the English nation to asking God to protect it. Um, so that's the earliest kind of liturgical piece that we have in English. But it's also important to know that while Henry was alive, there were all these various scholars and religious leaders who were working behind the scenes to prepare for the reform of the English church. They were just waiting for Henry to die. So these were people who were influenced by the Reformation on the continent in places like Germany and Switzerland. They were very much influenced by people like Martin Luther in Germany, John Calvin in Geneva, um, Zwingli in Zurich. So they were absorbing these Protestant ideas, even if Henry was still very much, a kind of a traditional Catholic. The opportunity really comes in 1547 when Henry dies and his son Edward um, becomes king. But Edward's only 9 years old. Edward's been raised a Protestant, and his guardians, who are kind of directing policy at that time, are also staunch Protestants because his mother, Edward's mother, was a Protestant. Um, So at 9 years old, I don't know how much Edward sort of directed things, but as he got a little bit older, he died when he was only 16. Um, Edward, as king, made it very clear that he wanted England to be a Protestant nation, and so the reform could go ahead. And so that's when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop under Henry but couldn't really do anything, um, that's when he produces the first English Book of Common Prayer, and it comes out 2 years later in 1549. And there are a couple of revisions, first in 1552, um, and the difference between 1549 and 1552 is that 1552 is a lot more Protestant. And then in 1559, under Elizabeth I, you kind of get a kind of a combination, a midway Book of Common Prayer. Um, but also during this time, publication of the Bible in English not only is legal, but it's it's promulgated, it's encouraged. If you look at these two pictures, and I don't know how easily you can see them, the top is what worship in England would have looked like before the reign of Edward VI. Very traditional Catholic. The priest is in a chasuble facing an altar that's affixed to the wall. There's candles, there's images of saints. Um, there's a server there helping. There's what we call a rood screen, which is you can see the kind of the horizontal bar with the cross on top. That was a screen that divided the altar area from the people. Um, so very kind of a very traditional um, church. And then below, you can see this is what it looked like after the Reformation, after Edward takes the throne. They take away the rood screen, they take away the altar, and you see this wooden table out from the wall. And you see the priest, instead of having his back to the people, he's off to the side. He's always stood at the north side of the table. North because every church, the chancel area where the altar was, faced east. So if we're facing east in these pictures. So the priest would stand off to the side. You see um, a big flagon and you see a big loaf of bread on the table. And that's another huge change, that they went from little tiny wafers and the people never getting the wine at all to a big loaf of bread, which everybody would get a piece, and a big flagon of wine, and everybody would get to drink, a good bit of it. Um, that this was all part of a drastic change in worship that reflected more Protestant views. You also see off to the right a big pulpit, because preaching was being emphasized, um, whereas it had not been before. And the tablets on the back of the wall, usually they had the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and I think the maybe the Apostles' Creed up affixed to the church wall in English so that people could learn. So the emphasis was on learning, on things being in English, and also they took down the images of saints, right? And so you see in the back wall a clear window. So that just gives you a sense of the radical change in the physical appearance of the church and the style of worship before and after the Reformation. Now, Henry's daughter, Mary Tudor, kind of for a brief 5-year window, takes the church back to Rome between 1553 and 1558. Um, but that she dies, only 5 years after taking the throne. And so her sister, Elizabeth, who was raised a Protestant, um, then took the throne and brings back worship in English. She brings back married clergy, and she kind of restores this idea of worship in English. And there's still a lot of diversity in English Christianity at this time. So Elizabeth's role is to kind of hold together these diverse perspectives. And the kind of the three major types of English Christians are their images and their beliefs are there on the left. What we call the church Anglicans, who's the guy in the middle. He's satisfied with the Book of Common Prayer. He likes a little bit of ceremonial, but not too much. He's like, this is good. We're going to hold on to this. There's the Puritans on the right who want it to be even more stark and simple and just go back to the Bible, get rid of the Book of Common Prayer. Let's become even more Protestant. But there are still Roman Catholics in England at the time, um, who are still loyal to the Pope, but um, Roman Catholics are not always wanting to get rid of Elizabeth. I mean, some of them are happy to just, obey the Queen, but as long as they can worship the way they want. But technically, Roman Catholicism was illegal during this time, and so a lot of the more wealthy Catholics were able to practice their Catholicism in private. But this is the situation that Elizabeth was trying to sort of deal with. Um, but the thing that she tried to use to hold everybody together was the Book of Common Prayer in English and having everybody worship the same way. Your beliefs might be a little different. You might be more of a Puritan or Catholic in your theology, but as long as people worshiped according to the English Book of Common Prayer, that was supposed to hold everybody together. In the 17th century, the church continues to evolve, and there's a new translation of the Bible commissioned in 1611, and that's the Bible that we know as the King James Bible, because it was James the First, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, um, he authorized it because it's time we had a new Bible. And the Bible that a lot of people were using, the Geneva Bible, um, was too Protestant for him because it didn't mention bishops. And James was very insistent that the Church of England should have bishops. Um, and so he wanted a Bible in part that sort of helped him to, kind of hold on to that. But that translation, they had a whole bunch of scholars come together, and to each take a book or a series of books, and it was quite a project. The best scholars in England were part of that. Um, but in the middle of the century, Great Britain was in a civil war, and the supporters of King Charles I and those who kind of supported the Church of England with bishops, known as the Cavaliers, were at war with the supporters of Parliament, and those who also supported a purified church, like the Puritan church without bishops. So there was a civil war, and for a period of time from 1649 to 1660, Britain was actually technically a commonwealth, governed by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector and Parliament. But during that time, the Book of Common Prayer was actually outlawed, and the bishops were deprived of their seats and exiled. So there was this period in the middle of the 17th century where the Church of England was actually more Presbyterian, actually, than it was what we would call Anglican. But that tumultuous history in the 17th century is really important to understanding how the church developed in this country, in the United States. So eventually they brought back the monarchy in 1660. They brought back the bishops, and they brought back the Book of Common Prayer. It was slightly revised, but that's actually still the official Book of Common Prayer in England. But they have a lot of extra liturgies that are used as well. So how did the church get to North America? Well, obviously, I think we know this, right? The first English settlers actually came to the New World in the early 1600s, and they landed in Virginia. They were there to make money, but they were all Anglicans. And they brought their clergy with them. They brought chaplains. And so in the South, in Virginia, the Church of England became the established church in that colony and also in other Southern colonies. So that's what you'll notice that, I mean, to this day, the Episcopal Church is in some ways is larger and kind of more dominant in the South than it is up in New England where we are. The English who came to our part of the world in 1620 were Puritans, though. They were not Anglicans. And so in Massachusetts, the established church was not Anglican, it was Puritan, and it was congregational, which means that each individual congregation governed itself. There were no bishops. Now, there were Anglicans, there were Church of England folks in New England, but they were very much the minority up here.
Is there a particular
And in the colonies, some Anglicans were loyal to the crown and others favored independence. So our church, those who were Anglicans, they didn't all think the same way. More Anglicans in the South favored independence. They figured out that they could govern themselves, and they had created a structure that worked for them. Anglicans up here in New England, they tended to be loyalists. This is a picture of Old North Church in the North End, the interior, and then a drawing of it on the right. Um, and we know that that was an important place in the American Revolution, signaling to the colonial regiments that the British were coming. But after the American Revolution, after America won its independence, Anglicans had to sort of figure out how to work together. Like, how do we form a church independent of England? We love our Anglican traditions. We love the Book of Common Prayer. We have different political views. Um, but we're going to have to figure out how to work together and how to develop our own Book of Common Prayer. And one thing we had never had was bishops. All the Anglican churches in this country were officially under the Bishop of London. England never sent bishops over here. Now, when we gained our independence, it was clear to the Anglicans who were still here that they needed to create a new church, and we needed bishops. They believed that having bishops was an important aspect of who they were. It tied them to the early church. It gave them stability. Bishops are an ancient kind of form of leadership, going back to the early church. But they couldn't they couldn't go to England to get bishops because if you were ordained or consecrated in England, you had to swear loyalty to the crown. And they couldn't have their bishops doing that because now the United States of America was its own country. So the first candidate for bishop, actually, in this country, Samuel Seabury, who was from Connecticut, he had to go to Scotland to be consecrated. The Scottish Church was not the established church in Scotland. The Scottish established church was Presbyterian. So all the Anglicans in Scotland kind of didn't have that church and state enmeshment. And so they didn't have to require allegiance to the crown. So we got our first bishop in 1784.
Are you going
Um,
there to sing?
But you need three bishops to ordain a bishop. And so we needed two more. And we finally got two more. Eventually, England said, okay, we can ordain your bishops without having them swear allegiance to the crown. But Seabury was our first bishop. But even before they had bishops in the late 1700s, these former Anglicans had still been getting together to try to organize their new church. And from the very beginning, they envisioned a church that was governed by both clergy and laity. I mean, this was unique. They envisioned a democratic church that gathered every 3 years in a general convention. We do that today. And the first constitution of the Episcopal Church was actually approved in 1789, and a revised Book of Common Prayer, which was very much like the English one, but it didn't have an oath of loyalty to the crown. And our Eucharistic prayer we actually got from the Scots. That was sort of one of they asked, I said, if we consecrate your first bishop, will you use our Eucharistic prayer? And we did. So the official name was called the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And in the first decades of the church, so late 1700s to early 1800s, our church was very small. It could easily have disappeared if it were not for the active leadership and ministry of bishops like John Henry Hobart in New York and bishops like Jackson Kemper, who was a missionary bishop out west. There was a concerted effort to try to spread, but it was really hard for a long time because Anglicans or Episcopalians were associated with loyalists, with people who were in a sense traitors to the American cause. But we eventually sort of got over that. And during the Civil War, I just wanted to mention this, that the Episcopal Church actually did split because we split into two countries for a period of time. And so the Episcopal Church in the South became the Protestant Episcopal Church in the Confederate States of America. And I think it's important to note that many Episcopalians owned slaves. And many more of them benefited economically from slavery wherever they lived, South or North. And after the Civil War, the two churches came back together, and nobody really even mentioned slavery. It was a very strange time, I think. And we were still reckoning with that. We never really kind of got over it. This is a picture of what I consider to be an infamous Episcopalian, Leonidas Polk, who was a bishop in Louisiana, but he was also a general and a slave owner. A general. He was killed during the Civil War. So we have this weird relationship, I think, with slavery and with military. Because the Anglican Church was so embedded in the nation in England, there was a unity of church and state. Even when we separated church and state, I think there's still this kind of genetic, I don't know, this genetic history or genetic awareness of being part of an established church that we sort of sometimes the Episcopal Church kind of falls back on. I just wanted to tell you about a few figures in Episcopal Church history that have a Massachusetts connection, just because I think this is gives us a sense of the diversity in the Episcopal Church. So Phillips Brooks was rector of Trinity Church, Boston. You can see the interior of that church, and you can see that very large pulpit off to the left, which was built specifically for him. He was a very large man and an amazing preacher. He was also Bishop of Massachusetts for a few years. He died rather young by our terms, but he's also the author of O Little Town of Bethlehem. So he was an Episcopalian. Another important figure is Vida Dutton Scudder, who was a Wellesley College professor starting in the late 1800s. She was a member of the Society of the Companions of the Holy Cross, which still exists. They have a retreat center called Adlinrude, which is up in Byfield, Massachusetts. But she's so interesting. She co-founded the Episcopal Church Socialist League and became a member of the Socialist Party. And she was a pacifist, a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Her writings are really, really important about social justice and faith. And then there's Frances Perkins, who was born in Boston, um, who became an Episcopalian later in her life in Chicago. But she was Secretary of Labor under FDR and the architect of Social Security. And her faith was instrumental in her work in establishing Social Security and greater equality in our nation. Then there's Jonathan Myrick Daniels, who was a seminarian at Episcopal Divinity School over in Cambridge, Mass, um, who at an evensong at Church of the Advent on Beacon Hill was praying and listening to the Magnificat, Mary's song, during evensong, and where she says, the rich shall be sent away empty, the poor shall be satisfied, and the powerful shall be taken down. And he realized he needed to go to the South to work for voting rights. And he was killed while shielding a young woman from a shooter. Um, so I think his witness obviously is one that we need to remember. Then there's Pauli Murray, who was a lawyer, teacher, civil rights activist, mentor for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, kind of architect, very influential in terms of the um, gender rights, equal rights for women. She was the first African American woman ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, 1977. So that was 3 years after the first women were ordained. But she was sponsored by Emmanuel Church in Boston, and she taught at Brandeis. So it's a very strong connection here. And then I'm thinking of course, Barbara Harris, who was the first woman ever anywhere ordained a bishop in the Anglican Communion in 1989, and it was here. It was in Massachusetts, and she was bishop suffragan in this diocese for many years until she retired. I don't know, about 2010, something like that. Um, she, I think she was wearing a bulletproof vest during her ordination. So that's the end just of my brief presentation. Brief. We have a few minutes. Um, so I'm curious, what do you notice? I mean, that's like a whirlwind tour, obviously, through the Anglican Church and the American Episcopal Church. But what do you notice or what are you wondering about? That's a lot. I kind of threw a lot of information at you. One thing I want to say is that the Episcopal Church, as it was founded as a democratic church where governance was shared by clergy and laity, that was unique. And it was the first Anglican church outside of England to kind of come into being. All the other Anglicans in the world at that time, they were still part of the Church of England. And so in England, there is more democratic leadership and governance now, but there wasn't then. And the fact that our church was created from the beginning to have this kind of legislative structure, it was very intentional. And a lot of the same people who put together um, the Episcopal Church Constitution and kind of envisioned its governance were the same people involved in writing the US Constitution and sort of envisioning, Congress. And so if you look at our structure, it very much mirrors in a lot of ways the governance structure of the United States. But what's different is that we consider ourselves to be, we're a church. We're not a nation. And we have bishops, and bishops have a certain sacred apostolic authority that we believe we can trace back to the apostles. I mean, we preserved apostolic succession because each of our bishops were consecrated by bishops who had themselves been consecrated by other bishops, and we can trace that back. Um, so it's kind of an odd combination. I think sometimes there's a bit of tension between our democratic, impulses and the idea that we also give theological and kind of practical authority to our bishops. But even the bishops have to abide by our general convention, so that the kind of the highest authority in our church is not the presiding bishop. It's it's general convention. Now the bishops are part of that. They constitute their own house, so they talk about things together, they propose legislation, they can veto, stuff that comes to them from the House of Deputies, which is where the other clergy and the laity are working as delegates. Um, but they're part of the system. And once General Convention agrees and it becomes part of the canons, which is our series of laws, even the bishops are supposed to obey that. So I think that's that's pretty unique, actually, I think, in the Anglican Communion. Um, I think Canada is probably, closer to that, but it's unusual. And it explains why I think we have moved in the direction that we've moved around women's ordination, LGBTQ inclusion, because the governance of our church is something that we do together.
At least we hate to break in, but we're going to go to Compline.
Okay.
And next time, I'd really like to hear Emmanuel talk about his perspective of the history of the church from Africa.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
I
so
think we
see you
can
next
make
week.
Thank you. Good night.
2 weeks. Yep.
2 weeks.
Yes.
So any other, we can go a little bit longer if we need to.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Emmanuel, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I learned a great deal. Wanted to ask, does the Episcopal Church in the US still have any obligatory affiliation with the Church of England now?
No. So and we never, yeah, once we became our own church, um, the Church of England was our sibling, but had no authority over us. And so for us, in fact, I can talk maybe next week. I'm supposed to talk about the Book of Common Prayer, but I can also talk at some point about the Anglican Communion. The various Anglican churches around the world, as you know, a lot of them are in former British colonies. And when they became independent, then they had now have their own Anglican church, which governs itself. Um, and so the Archbishop of Canterbury and the church in England doesn't have authority over these other churches. But the Archbishop of Canterbury is sort of he's our first among equals. I mean, we give him great, reverence, but he can't tell us what to do.
Yeah. And the last question I had, I was whether there's any trace of um, people from the US who um, took the Anglican preaching to Africa, because commonly what we know there, we know um, we know about the missionaries who mainly came from the West, uh, pairing with colonialists. But I wonder if there are any um, missionaries who may have come from the US to take the gospel to Africa.
Yeah, there were. I have to look up and just find out a little bit more about where they went.
Yes.
Um, I mean, we also know, for instance, the country of Liberia was founded by
The US.
freed, African slaves, and a lot of them took, Anglicanism with them. But that's different from that. I mean, that's sort of in some ways that's African American missionaries. But I mean, a good part of Africa, I think, had been obviously colonized by England. So, but I'm sure there were places that we went. I'll have to look that up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the question I had is, it sounds like we're using like the terms like Anglican and Episcopalian interchangeably. Um, is there ever an instance where they are distinct things, especially here in America?
Yes.
And like when are the instances in which we distinctly say this is Anglican and this is Episcopalian? When can we use them both? I only ask just because, for like, I don't know if it's just semantics or it really does matter. But I have a friend who is in Texas, and he is attempting to become ordained as specifically an Anglican
Okay.
priest
Yep.
versus an Episcopalian. So
Yeah.
yeah, just that's my question.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be very confusing. So, um, we are the Episcopal Church is part of the Anglican tradition, and just defining Anglican as emerging from the root that is the Church of England.
Sure.
It gets complicated in this country because of the splits that have been happening especially in the late 20th century and continue, where churches and congregations, people have separated from the Episcopal Church,
Mhm.
wanted to retain their connections to the Anglican tradition as a whole,
Mhm.
but rejected our stance on some on women, on LGBTQ stuff. And so they have claimed the name Anglican as part of their title, um, to indicate that they consider themselves to be the kind of the true inheritors of Anglicanism in this country. And also because if they use the word Episcopal, it would get very confusing.
Mhm.
So in this country, it's kind of weird because I feel like we also are Anglicans, you
Mhm.
know. But if you say that and people know about these other churches, it gets very confusing. But like if you go to Canada,
Mhm.
the version of our church, our progressive
Mhm.
apostolic church is the Anglican Church of Canada,
Got it.
right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean, but they aren't connected to the Anglican Church in North America, for instance, ACNA.
Hmm.
So it gets very confusing.
Got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Who has a right to the name? I don't know. Any other questions or thoughts?
I was just curious, and thank you so much. I know we're a little past time, but the presentation was great. You mentioned a little bit about kind of reconciling, struggling with the issue of slavery, and just understanding kind of the progressiveness that you've kind of outlined and things like that, and some modern day comments on reparations and things like that. I wasn't sure if there had been something kind of proclaimed by the Episcopal Church that, yes, this is our history, we recognize it, or is it just kind of still in the background?
We're getting better at it. I think there's certainly, like, for instance, in our diocese, I know we have a racial justice commission that is working hard to kind of investigate the possibilities of reparations and of supporting congregations and people of color and kind of um, addressing the inequities. I, I believe the church has sort of made statements about rejecting any kind of white supremacy and acknowledging our history in terms of race relations. And it's ongoing. It's very much ongoing. And individual congregations also, I think, are doing this work to kind of investigate to what extent their buildings or their endowments rest on the backs of enslaved persons. So we're working on it. We're working on it. Yeah.
All right,
And I
awesome.
will also say,
Sorry,
as
I do have to hop off.
okay,
But thank you so much. I'll see you guys at the next session.
great. Thanks so much, Jessica. Yeah, so I'll just finish by saying the kind of diversity that I showed you in Elizabethan, the English church, is part of our heritage. And so that's part of who we are, is that we come from a tradition that has tried to kind of hold together the more Catholic kind of roots of our church, and as well as the principle of ongoing reformation and purification. And so we're not the only church that tries to do that. The Lutherans try to do that. The Roman Catholic Church has certainly tried to embrace, ongoing reformation. But I think for us, it's a very conscious thing that we've sort of inherited, that we see value in both the apostolic ancient tradition, um, and also the need to keep moving on and reforming. Um, and we try to keep all of that in one tent, which is hard. It's really hard. So you will meet Episcopalians today, who will very firmly say, I'm a Protestant. And you will also find Episcopalians who will say, no, I'm actually a Catholic. I'm just not Roman Catholic. And I tend to fall more into that second category. But we're all Episcopalians, and you will see with one prayer book, um, celebrations of the Eucharist that look very Catholic, with a lot of ceremonial, a lot of ritual, um, and some that look very plain and very Protestant. And the same is true with our theology. So we're trying to kind of hold that together in a very big tent. So we're going to talk more about that over the next couple of months. I think in 2 weeks we're going to talk about the Book of Common Prayer. Um, so that'll be our opportunity, I think, to really explore that. All right, I'll let you all go, and hopefully I'll see you on Sunday, and See you in a couple weeks. All right.
Sounds good.
Take
Thank
care.
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.